There is a post sitting on Donald Trump's social media account that every Canadian needs to read in full context, because the two words in it are not a joke, not a negotiating tactic, and not the offhand remark of a man who doesn't know what he's saying. Canada reported 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction. Its GDP shrank. The Bank of Canada confirmed it, and within hours of that data becoming public, the President of the United States opened his phone and posted 2 words about your country. 51st state. No punctuation. No explanation. No elaboration needed. He has said it enough times now that the meaning is understood. And the response from Ottawa, the government elected 4 months earlier on a platform of standing up to exactly this threat, was a statement saying it would never happen, followed by silence. That silence is the story. Not Trump's post, not the recession data. The silence from a government that has been caught, 18 months into the most serious sovereignty threat Canada has faced in living memory, without a plan that matches the scale of what is being proposed. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story did not start with a social media post. It started at a dinner at Mar-a-Lago in December 2024. A private meeting between then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President-elect Donald Trump, held because Canada was trying to get ahead of the tariff threats before the inauguration. What happened at that dinner was described to reporters afterward by Canadian officials who called the 51st state comments clearly in jest. Trudeau's own advisor Gerald Butts posted publicly that Trump had made the same joke during his first term. He's doing it to rattle Canadian cages, Butts wrote. When someone is trying to get you to freak out, don't. 2 months later, Trudeau was caught on a hot microphone at a closed-door meeting, telling a group of executives something very different. He said the 51st state threat was a real thing. And in the same meeting, he told them what he believed Trump actually wanted. Not a joke, not leverage, access to Canada's critical minerals, the oil, the uranium, the potash, the rare earth metals and the nickel and the copper and the fresh water. Trump had looked at the map of North America and seen something very specific, a country sitting on top of virtually every resource the United States needs for the next century of economic and military dominance, governed by a parliamentary system that had spent the previous decade making it harder to extract those resources, and he had decided that the most efficient solution was to make the border disappear. Trudeau's private admission that this was real came on February 7, 2025. 3 days earlier, on February 4th, Trump had signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on almost all Canadian goods. Almost all. The exception was energy, oil, gas, uranium, potash, which received a 10% tariff instead of 25%. That differential was not an oversight, it was a message. The industries that Trump actually needs from Canada got a lower rate because hitting them at 25% would have driven up American energy costs, shut down American Midwestern refineries that depend on Alberta's heavy crude for up to 70% of their feedstock, and created an immediate domestic political crisis in the farm states that rely on Saskatchewan potash to grow the food that feeds America. He wanted the leverage without the self-inflicted damage, so he priced it accordingly. By the time Trump gave his inaugural address on January 20th, he had already said it publicly at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the room reportedly went quiet with shock, and at a press conference on January 7th, where he ruled out military force, but specifically, explicitly, deliberately threatened economic force. Not as a joke, not as a metaphor, as a stated policy tool. He said the border between Canada and the United States was an artificially drawn line that looks like it was done with a ruler. He said that Canada and the US together would really be something. He said he expected to use economic pressure, tariffs, trade restrictions, financial leverage to move Canada toward integration. And the press conference ended, and the Canadian government issued a statement saying it would never happen, and life went on. Except it didn't quite go on the way it had before, because what happened in the months that followed was not an annexation. It was something more subtle and in some ways more dangerous. a systematic demonstration that Canada's economic independence from the United States is far more theoretical than most Canadians had ever been asked to confront. Here are the numbers that matter. 80% of Canada's crude oil production, approximately 4 million barrels a day, flows south to American refineries. The single largest pipeline moving that oil is Enbridge's mainline system, which carries 3 million barrels a day into the American Midwest. The refineries on the other end of that pipeline, in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, depend on Alberta's heavy crude for up to 70% of their supply. They are not set up to run on lighter American grades. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The pipeline connections aren't there. In theory, they could adapt. In practice, the transition would take years and cost billions, and would drive American fuel prices to levels that no elected official in the Midwest could survive politically. Canada is not exporting oil to the United States as a favor. Canada is exporting oil to the United States because American industry was built around Canadian oil and cannot function without it. The same is true of uranium. Canada produces approximately 24% of the world's uranium supply, second only to Kazakhstan. Saskatchewan's mines, operated primarily by Cameco, supply approximately 1 in 4 barrels of uranium going into American reactors. Ontario Premier Doug Ford put the number plainly at a Toronto Global Forum in October 2025. They have 94 turbines that rely on Canadian uranium, 94 American nuclear reactors, producing electricity for millions of American homes and businesses, running on fuel extracted from Canadian rock. Trump applied a 10% tariff to uranium imports from Canada, not 25%. Again, not an accident. And then there is potash. More than 80% of the potash used by American farmers comes from Canada, primarily from Saskatchewan, primarily from Nutrien, the Saskatoon-headquartered company that is the largest potash producer in the world. Potash is fertilizer. Fertilizer is food. American agricultural productivity in the Corn Belt, the wheat states, the soybean regions, it depends on Saskatchewan potash to a degree that most Americans have never been asked to think about. Doug Ford said it simply. Farmers all throughout the US rely on potash coming from Saskatchewan. They'd be devastated if you cut them off on potash. Those are not the words of a politician making an abstract geopolitical argument. Those are the words of someone describing the supply chain that feeds America. A supply chain that runs through 2 Canadian provinces that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. So when Trump posts 51st state, after Canada enters a technical recession, the question that Ottawa has never answered publicly and clearly is this. What exactly is the plan? Because the leverage that Canada has in this relationship is enormous. The oil, the uranium, the potash, the critical minerals, the fresh water, and the leverage that the United States has in return is equally enormous. The tariffs have already caused real damage. The auto sector in Ontario has been gutted. Investment decisions that should have gone to Canada have gone to the United States instead. The recession that triggered Trump's post was not a coincidence. It was, at least in part, a consequence of 18 months of trade uncertainty that made it rational for companies to choose American locations over Canadian ones. Mark Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister in March 2025, replacing a Trudeau government that had been politically exhausted and constitutionally compromised. He won the April election in part because Canadians rallied around the sovereignty question. The national pride activated by Trump's contempt turned the polls from a certain conservative majority to a fourth liberal government. Carney told Trump directly that the 51st state language was not useful. Trump called Carney a big step up from Trudeau. They met at the G7 in Kananaskis in June 2025. They agreed to begin renegotiating the trade relationship. And the 51st state posts kept coming, most recently in June 2026 when the recession data landed, and the response from Ottawa was the same as it has always been. It will never happen. Canada is not for sale. Here is the problem with that response. Nobody is proposing to buy Canada. What is being proposed, What is being actively pursued through tariffs and trade pressure and the deliberate targeting of economic vulnerability is a slow restructuring of the relationship between the two countries that makes Canadian independence progressively more expensive and American integration progressively more attractive. Not annexation by declaration. Annexation by arithmetic. Make the cost of being Canadian high enough, long enough, and the political conversation inside Canada changes. And in one province, it already has. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith did not stand shoulder to shoulder with the other premiers when the tariff threats first landed. She rejected a unified Canadian response to Trump's threats. She called for diplomacy, not retaliation. She said she saw Trump's drill baby drill posture as an opportunity for Alberta's oil and gas sector. And in May 2025, the day after the federal Liberal government won its fourth consecutive mandate, winning all but 3 of Alberta's 37 federal seats for the Conservatives, while the Liberals governed from central Canada, Smith delivered a 20-minute televised address laying out a list of demands. Abolish the federal carbon tax, remove restrictions on pipeline development, reform equalization, recognize Alberta's right to its resources, and if those demands were not met, she would facilitate a citizen-led referendum on whether Alberta should leave Canada. She did not call for separation. She was careful not to call for separation, but she introduced legislation lowering the bar for citizens to force a provincial referendum and said clearly that if enough signatures were gathered, the question would be on the ballot. The question she would not personally put there, but would not block. And the polling in Alberta told the story behind the careful language. A majority of United Conservative Party supporters favoured separation, even as a majority of all Albertans still opposed it. The grassroots of the governing party in Canada's wealthiest resource province had concluded that the federal relationship was not worth preserving. That is not a fringe position in 2026. It is the organizing principle of a growing political movement in a province that has sent $244.6 billion more to Ottawa in taxes than it has received back in federal spending over 15 years. $15 billion to $20 billion a year after year, funding services in other provinces, while Alberta's own oil sector was regulated, restricted, and rhetorically condemned by federal governments that depended on Alberta's money to pay for the programs they built in central Canada. The Alberta Next panel, the advisory group Smith established after the election, recommended a referendum on leaving the Canada Pension Plan and a formal commission to renegotiate the equalization formula. Smith announced that 9 referendum questions would go to Albertans on October 19, 2026, including constitutional changes and immigration restrictions. A separation question was not on that ballot, but it was in the room. This is the context in which Trump posts 51st state and Ottawa says it will never happen. And the question that nobody in the national press has asked directly is, what if the arithmetic of Confederation eventually makes it rational for Alberta to ask whether it's true? Not rational by sentiment. Albertans are Canadians in every cultural and historical sense that word implies, but rational by dollars, by $15 billion a year flowing east, by a federal government in Ottawa that won its last election almost entirely without Alberta's votes, by a resource sector that was told for a decade that its future was over, only to discover that the future of the American economy depends on Alberta's oil, Saskatchewan's uranium, and Saskatchewan's potash, and that the country next door is willing to use all available economic force to maintain access to those things on its own terms. Trump's post said, 51st state. Ottawa said it will never happen. And somewhere between those two positions, in the gap between what the rhetoric says and what the economics show, is the actual condition of Canada's sovereignty in 2026. It is intact, it is real, it is not for sale. And it is under more pressure than at any point since Confederation. Not because an American president is serious about annexation, but because the conditions that make Canadians ask hard questions about their own federation are more visible now than they have ever been. That is the story behind the post, and it does not end with a statement from a Prime Minister's office.